Hello there, you're watching the Press Preview, our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. And it's time to see what's making the headlines with leader writers for The Observer and Telegraph, Sonia Sodha and Tim Stanley. So very good to see you both. And they're going to be taking us through all the top stories from now until midnight. So first of all, before we chat to them, let's take a look at what's making the front pages. And the Eye leads with the news that the Queen will not be attending the COP26 climate summit in Glasgow next week, having taken medical advice. It's something she deeply regrets, according to the front page of the Daily Mail. A thundering wake-up call for the world, with warnings of a 2.7 degrees Celsius temperature rise if countries fail to act. That's the lead story for The Guardian. Rishi Sunak's expected to use up to £30 billion from the proceeds of economic growth to invest in public services. Tomorrow's budget makes the front of The Times. The Metro highlights the Chancellor's wardrobe choices while being photographed preparing for his speech tomorrow, describing them as new age. We will be talking about that story. The Telegraph carries the findings of a report which calls the £37 billion of funding spent on the COVID test and trace scheme eye-watering, given it didn't bring about the return to normality the government desired. According to the Financial Times, the government is aiming to raise enough funds to block China from involvement in the UK's nuclear energy plans by front-loading the cost onto consumers' bills. And The Star criticises the actress Joanna Lumley for suggesting a return to wartime-style rationing. So, Sonia Sodha and Tim Stanley, I'm very pleased to say, are here with me tonight. Hello properly to both of you. So, first of all, you've picked out The Eye, Sonia, one of several of the papers that put this on their front page at some point. Queen pulls out of COP26 on doctors' advice. Disappointment, we're told, for the Queen, but I imagine disappointment as well for Boris Johnson, the hosts of COP26.
Yeah, I'm sure it's hugely disappointing for both of them, but the Queen is 95. She spent a night in hospital last week and she's been advised by her doctors only to undertake light duties. And, you know, the round trip to Glasgow doesn't fall into that category. So I'm sure she's really disappointed. I'm sure the Prime Minister will be disappointed, but I don't think that this will detract too much from the huge significance of what's going on in Glasgow. It's really, I know we're going to be talking about the sort of substance of the climate story later, but it's a massively important moment for world leaders coming together to figure out a plan and to make commitments in order to reduce the extent of global heating. So I think it's, you know, I think it's completely understandable. It's on health grounds. I don't think anyone would be expecting the Queen to travel up to Glasgow if her doctors are advising her not to. It's right that she rests. But I also don't think it will make too much difference diplomatically to the real meat of what's getting, what needs to be agreed at the summit.
Tim, do you agree with that? I'm sure you agree that the Queen's health should be the priority. But what about her impact on events like this? I mean, many people do consider a bit of a star turn. A lot of the world leaders love the opportunity to meet her. What effect can she have in these kind of scenarios?
A great deal, I think, and I'm sure that the royal family will continue to exert their usual kind of soft diplomacy. She is going to record a video message, so she will be felt there in spirit. She is 95, as has just been said. I sometimes struggle to go up to London in the morning, so I wouldn't want to send a 95-year-old, whatever condition they're in, up to Glasgow. I don't think it's unreasonable for her to stay, and these things can now be done remotely. Yeah, the royal family does exercise a certain amount of moral political pressure upon world leaders. When we had the big global investment summit last week, everyone was thrilled to be able to go to Windsor Castle to meet the Queen there. The royal family is very important. But I have to say, I suspect that the Queen's non-attendance is probably less significant than the non-attendance of President Xi of China, right? China this year is looking to produce more coal than ever before in order to make up for power cuts. You really need China to be at the heart of COP26. And if you can't get Beijing on board with whatever everyone agrees next week in Glasgow, it doesn't really amount to as much as Western leaders would like.
Let's move on, shall we, to the budget now, because obviously tomorrow is a big day with Rishi Sunak due to deliver his budget. Sonia, several of the papers go with this, not for the first time over the last few days. The Telegraph story suggests that Rishi Sunak will start building for life after COVID. So what's their angle on this?
Well, I think there's always two things you've got to look for with a budget. The first is the Chancellor's narrative and his spin on the figures and what he wants the world to look at his budget and see. And the second is the reality of what's going on and what the figures actually say and the detail of the announcements. For example, whether spending announced is new or whether it's a reheated announcement. And so I think what's interesting about this budget is we've got all the papers sort of briefing on the fact that Sunak is going to be going big on optimism and an age of optimism. And that is very much what he wants people to take away from the budget. And I think some of the stories that have been trailed in the run up to tomorrow definitely sort of show that that's his spin on it. So things, for example, like saying that the public sector pay freeze will be lifted. But the devil is in the detail. The country face a cost of living crisis. Millions of low-income families have lost just over £1,000 a year because of the universal credit cut. That comes in the decade of a decade of cuts to tax credits for low-income families with children that have seen some families lose thousands of pounds. It's true that it's been briefed that there's going to be an increase in the minimum wage, but that won't cover. I mean, the maximum you can get back from that if you're a low-income worker working full time after tax and universal credit deductions is just under £300, and families have lost £1,000. We've also got energy and food prices rising. So I think there's a real disjunct here between the optimism that the Chancellor is trying to convey, understandably, some might think in terms of a political spin, and the reality on the ground, which is that if you are a parent in low-paid work, the next few months is going to feel really, really grim in light of the cuts to things like universal credit, but also the increase in the energy price cap that's going to hit you next April, rising food prices, rising energy prices more generally. So I think there is a bit of a disjunct here between the note that the Chancellor is trying to strike and the reality on the ground for millions of low-paid parents.
Do you think that's right, Tim? Because The Guardian also picks up with this, the message he wants to send out ahead of the budget, at least, Chancellor to strike bullish note in budget. I mean, he's talking about a post-COVID economy. Some would say we're not post-COVID yet. And there are those challenges, aren't there? There is that squeeze that a lot of people are feeling at the moment that Sonia was talking about. How difficult is this going to be for him to create a feeling of optimism?
The interesting question, the anticipation is, what is going to be the big thing he will announce tomorrow that will be even more bullish and optimistic than everything else he's been quietly dripping through the press since September? This has been an incredibly well-trailed budget with bits of good news coming out over the course of weeks. And in fact, MPs in the Commons today were expressing their anger at that because that's not what you're supposed to do. In 1947, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Hugh Dalton, inadvertently gave away some budget details to a journalist. They appeared in a newspaper and Dalton had to resign. Whereas nowadays, as I said, you can actually trail your budget in advance for weeks. And crucially, looking back on it now, this was actually quite clever. He also trailed the pain in advance by telling us that national insurance would go up in order to pay for the NHS and social care. And that's the thing to bear in mind. There's a lot of stuff which is going to come out of this which will be optimistic and people will be very pleased to hear about, things like the increase in the minimum wage, increase in spending in the NHS, etc., etc. But we do also face a cost of living crisis, which in many ways is about the bill, the tab, and the long-term economic effect of the lockdown. And we're going to be paying for that some time to come. So by April of next year, whatever goodies you've got out of tomorrow's budget, April of next year, people are going to be hit by a rise in national insurance. They're probably going to be hit by a rise in council tax. Interest rates are almost certainly going to go up. So I think this has been politically very well staged and managed. I expect tomorrow he's going to say things are a lot better than you people thought they were. And it may well look like that in the light of the budget. But in the weeks to come, with all those tax increases, plus, of course, the reversal of that initial rise in universal credit, I suspect actually people are in for significant amounts of pain over a winter that, on top of all of that, could also add shortages of goods and rising costs of fuel. So he might be bullish and optimistic. I'm not so sure that voters and consumers will be this time next year.
Yeah, well, it's going to be interesting, isn't it? Let's quickly take in the Metro before we go to the break, because not only have we had various releases about what's going to be in the budget, we've also had a release of, I mean, it's traditional, isn't it, Sonia? We get a picture of the Chancellor working away on his budget speech. But I was convinced that the pictures of him with his dog were going to make the front pages, but no, it's his sandals or his sliders that's getting the attention in the Metro.
Yeah, it's his style choices, a choice of sandals and socks. I mean, I have to be, you're absolutely right, Anna. It is traditional that the Chancellor releases a photo or two in advance on Budget Eve, and that these are often the focus of conversations in the press. I have to confess, though, I couldn't care less what he wears as he's preparing his budget speech. I'm much more interested in what he's going to say and how that measures up against the reality of what families are going to be facing.
Tim?
I remember George Osborne had the Byron burger to show that he was working. He was eating while he was working, so he was so busy he couldn't even go out to eat. Whereas Rishi looks like he's getting ready for a sleepover. I wouldn't be surprised if he and his civil servants spent the night doing each other's hair. It's a very laid-back look, but that's always the impression he's trying to give. He's an effortless man, effortlessly brilliant and good-looking, and he's going to give us an effortless budget tomorrow as well, I'm sure.
Well, we had pictures of his pet and his snacks as well, so there are plenty of pictures to pore over if anyone's interested. We are going to take a break right there. Lots more to talk about coming up very shortly, including, was the COVID test and trace scheme worth its billions of pounds in funding? We're going to be talking about that next. Welcome back. You're watching the Press Preview. With me tonight going through the papers are Sonia Sodha and Tim Stanley. And Tim, we're kicking off this section with the front page story of the Daily Telegraph. Test and trace criticised as eye-watering waste of cash. And this is an MP's report, isn't it? What do they say?
That's correct. I'm going to have to actually hold up my phone because some of the figures are very precise and I don't want to get them wrong. It reveals that an extraordinary £37 billion was spent on this, which is the equivalent of around a fifth of the NHS's total budget. Around 2,000 consultants were hired, some of them employed at rates of more than £1,000 a day. At some points, there was only 11% of them actually doing anything. The figure never got beyond 49%. At the point at which test and trace was most needed, the system buckled and many people did not get their tests within 24 hours. Only a fraction of the several hundred million tests that were sent out were actually registered. And of course, it failed in its key objective, which was to avoid the lockdown over the winter. So having wasted this extraordinary amount of money on test and trace, the question is, what is the future of the programme? And what is the rationale for such a programme when we have the vaccine? It's an example of how extraordinary decisions were taken in the last 18 months, and they have to be accounted for. The idea that you can brush this under the carpet by saying it was a wartime-style situation, we had to make big decisions fast, and they weren't all going to be perfect. Well, fair enough, but ultimately money was wasted, time was wasted, and this was clearly a policy mistake, and there has to be some consequence for that.
Yeah, an interesting timing, isn't it, when we're talking about the Chancellor weighing up what cash he's got to play with tomorrow. I'm going to move us on, if that's all right, Sonia, because there's a story on the front of The Guardian that it would be nice to try and squeeze in before we go to the end of the programme. Their main story focuses on the UN report, the latest in a string of UN reports, talking about the warnings for global warming, saying that we're on track at the moment, given global pledges of temperatures of 2.7 degrees, way above the desired 1.5 degrees of global warming.
Yes, that's right. So at the heart of this new report from the UN is a figure that we've been living with for a long time, which is that if we want to prevent catastrophic, irreversible climate change of the sort that will see millions of people displaced, so really, really terrible consequences by the end of this century, we have to limit global heating to well below 2 degrees centigrade. And we've got a global target of 1.5. And this is the UN, the UN sort of periodically releases really grave warnings on this. This is the UN saying that at current rates, we're headed for 2.7 degrees by the end of the century.